So in the IVF world, it's very common to have miscarriages, to have stillbirths, to have medical terminations before they come up with, they have their happy baby. But what happens is, because people are just on that roller coaster and they're going for the next cycle, the next cycle's going to work, the next cycle's going to work. They're living on that hope. I find that people haven't processed the losses. It was incredibly difficult because the overriding memory I have is of being alone. I didn't know anybody else who was an IVF until quite late when I met one other person. The clinic I was with did have a support group, and I joined that support group. But then everybody started getting pregnant and they left. So again, there was just me like, what is going on? Why is it not happening for me?
So why did I start this podcast? After experiencing miscarriages and going through a challenging period of numbness and anger, I found healing by understanding my emotions, reconnecting with my body, and connecting with my soul, and also my spirit babies. My mission with this podcast is to enter a space of vulnerability and sacredness, of deeply personal stories of women who were impacted by pregnancy loss, miscarriages, stillbirth, and infertility. My goal is to bridge the gap between our losses and the deep spiritual insights that can come with them so that they can guide us toward healing and understanding beyond the physical realm. I'm Daisy May Reyes, and I bring together the wisdom of our wombs as a collective. Welcome to the Women Collective podcast, presented by the Oversoul Vibration. Today on the Women Collective podcast, we are joined by someone who has lived through the highs and lows of the IVF journey, and she has turned those experiences into a lifeline for others. Please welcome Anne Altamore, founder of Life After IVF. Anne, I'm glad that you're here with us to share your story today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation, Daisy. I'm very honored to be here.
Yes. Let's start with telling us about yourself and your journey as the founder of Life After IVF.
Yes, thank you. My journey to where I am today actually started about 27 years ago. So I started on an IVF journey myself, and that was a very long journey, off and on for about 12 years. And my first pregnancy was with twins, and I had a miscarriage very early. And what was really difficult to cope with was there was no support available. There were hardly anybody, or I couldn't find anybody who had lived experience of the IVF process or who had had losses in the counseling world. And there weren't a lot of support groups either where I live in Australia. So I felt incredibly alone in my loss. And I decided that one day, if I could, I would want to be in a position where nobody else would ever feel that alone and unsupported. At the time, I was in a marketing career, and I thought, well, this is where I am. This is what I've studied for. I'll do this. And when I retire, I will look at doing some sort of study and maybe work in some volunteer capacity. But life, as it does, takes you down different paths. So I did retire from my corporate marketing career at the age of 50, and I actually retrained as a counselor and a psychotherapist. So I hold a master's in counseling and psychotherapy, and I also have a coaching certification. So it was a long process, but it was something that was always there in the back of my mind.
Yes, thank you, Anne. And I feel that this has inspired you to create Life After IVF. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Because one of the things I found was when we finished the IVF journey without a baby, and that again I found myself without any support. We saw counselors and we saw psychologists, but there was always something that didn't quite gel. So when I finished my study and I was thinking about, where do I want to practice? What target audience do I want to look at? I noticed that there's actually a gap in continuity of care for people who finish a fertility journey. So it doesn't have to be only IVF. There's different things that people do, but there's definitely a gap for people who are childless, not by choice. So I thought my life story is about my life after IVF, and I thought I'd use that as my business name as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that is beautiful. I love the name Life After IVF because really we do need guidance after going through those treatments, right?
Yeah.
And so thank you for doing that for others. Can you walk
Oh,
us
thank you.
through what goes on in Life After IVF?
So like I said, I'm a qualified counselor and psychotherapist, and I also do a little bit of coaching around grief. So my work mainly is about working with people who have finished their fertility journey. And I started off intending to support people who were childless. But what I found with the questions and the inquiries that were coming through is there's a lot of people who go on an IVF journey and they may have their baby, but they haven't processed the journey. They haven't processed the losses that have happened along the journey. So in the IVF world, it's very common to have miscarriages, to have stillbirths, to have medical terminations before they come up with, they have their happy baby. But what happens is because people are just on that roller coaster and they're going for the next cycle, the next cycle's going to work, the next cycle's going to work. They're living on that hope. I find that people haven't processed the losses. So I also do work with people who want to come back and just talk about what's happened to them, talk about processing the loss. For some people, they may have created a lot of embryos. And the question that's often asked is, I feel sad about the embryos that I've lost. Do I have the right to grieve them? And my answer is absolutely, you do, because that's your connection to potential hopes and dreams of a child. But predominantly, I work with people who are childless after an infertility journey.
Could you also walk us through your experience with IVF yourself?
So we went on IVF in the mid to late 90s when it was still quite new and there was still a lot of research going on. So we went through all the tests, a lot of invasive surgeries to, find out what was going on. And for us, it is male factor infertility. So we actually went on what at that time was a very new procedure called ICSI. And I think it stands for, no, I won't try to stand it because I'll probably get it wrong. But basically, what they do is they pick one particular sperm and inject it into the egg. So a lot of the images that we see for IVF, where you've got the egg and the sperm going in, that's actually an ICSI process. So that was what we were on. So we had no trouble creating embryos. At that time, they used to grade them, and we always had very good, high quality embryos. But for some reason, after the first pregnancy, I never got a positive pregnancy result again. So in total, we created 19 embryos over a space of 12 years. Off and on, I did take breaks, but yeah, none of them resulted in a pregnancy.
Oh, wow, I'm very sorry to hear about that.
Thank you.
12 years of treatment and
Yeah.
19 embryos after. May I ask, how was the the process of just realizing that this is the reality that you were facing at that time?
It was incredibly difficult because the overriding memory I have is of being alone. I didn't know anybody else who was an IVF until quite late when I met one other person. The clinic I was with did have a support group, and I joined that support group. But then everybody started getting pregnant and they left. So again, there was just me like, what is going on? Why is it not happening for me? But I think the main thing and what really spurred me to actually become a counselor is there was very little support outside of the clinics. So I had a fabulous IVF psychologist. She was absolutely amazing. My IVF specialist was amazing. But outside of that, there wasn't very much support. And again, there was that feeling of, why are you grieving? Like, just keep going, just keep going. That was always the thing. And, a lot of people still say that. They said, oh, you don't have kids, go on IVF. That'll work. As we know, the results actually, more people leave their IVF roller coaster without a child than people who do get a child. And it's a very long and very expensive process. So again, I think for me, if I look back now, the biggest memory I have is two things. One is disenfranchised grief, because there was no acknowledgement of the grieving process. And two, I was feeling incredibly alone during that time.
I see. And this alone feeling that every woman who endured this infertility roller coaster, is this very common? And do you believe that is there like such a profound connection between those who had experienced the infertility and their lost embryos or pregnancies?
From the people I speak to, I think that sense of being alone is gradually reducing, depending on the person's personality and whether they talk about it. Because again, one of the things is a lot of people keep their treatment very, very quiet. But of course, in the world of social media, there's access to online support groups. There's access to Facebook groups. There's some beautiful Instagram pages where people talk about what's happening. So I think that sense of aloneness is probably not as big as it was when I was on treatment. The connection to the embryos, I think that emotional connection happens as soon as the mum, and to speak from the point of view of the mum, as soon as the mum makes the decision that this is going to be the next pregnancy, and when we're on IVF, we live on a lot of hope. We hope that the next one's going to work. So as soon as the mum has that emotional connection, that baby is already real to her. So I have spoken to people who actually call their embryos M babies. And these days, with the genetic testing and things like that happen even before the embryo is planted, there's already so much emotional investment into the process. I heard someone say, I knew that embryo was going to be a daughter. How do you tell me that wasn't real? So that connection starts very, very early. And for a lot of people I speak to, they're already love. They already, love this bunch of cells that is going to be their baby. And also with the IVF process, you also see photos. You see photos of your embryo at various stages. I know we saw photos every time they did a transfer. And a lot of people, depending on their personality, some may connect at that point. And, some people will say, no, I'll wait for a specific milestone. I'll wait for a specific time before I actually form that connection.
I would like to ask a follow-up question because as you mentioned about the connection, it seemed to create that emotional, can I say, attachment to the embryo or the cell. And if that is the case, like what have you noticed as far as psychological challenges during and after your IVF journey, and also in the clients that you have met?
Yeah. I find the biggest thing that actually hasn't changed from when I was on treatment to now is disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief is when there is no acknowledgement of the grief that someone is experiencing. That's when society doesn't acknowledge your grief, or society dismisses your grief as valid. Um, and that is the biggest thing that we find, because for a lot of people, they are grieving a loss, but there's no acknowledgement of it. There's no rituals to mark the end. A lot of people feel that they don't have permission to grieve. Um, and for a lot of people, if the pregnancy progresses and they get to a certain milestone that's an accepted stage, there's people acknowledge the grief, they acknowledge it as a loss. But in the very early stages, in fact, I've heard people say they've been told, why are you so sad? It was, just a miscarriage, or it was just that your embryos didn't take, just forget about it and move on. So there is that lack of acknowledgement. And for some people, they also feel like, oh, I shouldn't grieve, I'm being silly, which is absolutely not the case. Because if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling that it's a loss, it's a loss. And people have every right to grieve. They have every right to mourn. Because one of the things with that is, I'll just talk about embryos first. That embryo was the embodiment of all your hopes and dreams. That embryo was your dream of, having a baby. And for a lot of people, they've already planned out a whole life for that child. I remember one of my embryo transfers, and I was incredibly stressed. And they were saying, relax, relax, think happy thoughts. And without thinking about it, I had already walked through every milestone of this child, the first day of school, graduating from university, their wedding day, all in a space of less than 5 minutes.
Do you also meet with male clients as well, or just women in your practice?
I do work with men as well. I don't have that many male clients. I would love to have more. What we find a lot is, because the process is so focused on the women, a lot of men actually feel quite detached from the process. And what I find is also a lot of men are so busy looking after their partner that they forget to look after themselves. And a lot of men also don't acknowledge the depth of the loss that they are feeling. So, again, to any men who are listening out there, your loss is just as valid. Your feelings of sadness, your feelings of grief are just as valid as your partner's. And, I really encourage you to speak to somebody if you feel that you would like to process those feelings.
And do you notice any difference between how the male grieve and the women in your practice?
I think there isn't actually like a gender observation, but there's definitely a difference in grieving styles between people. So there is what we call the instrumental and the intuitive grieving styles. This is what the research tells us. And it used to be called the male and the female, but what we're finding is there's actually no gender to it. And what I find is that we're on a spectrum. People may be more tuned towards one way of grieving or the other. So instrumental is when people need to do something about their grief. So these are the people who, run marathons, they set up foundations, they do fundraisers, or, they have to go out and chop wood or pull up weeds or whatever. So they need to do things to express what they're feeling. The intuitive grievers, and it used to be called female grieving, but, again, like I said, it's not a female or male thing. Those are the people who want to talk. They're the people who want to process how they're feeling. They're the people who will go to a support group. They're the people who will go to counseling. They're the people who will do the journaling. And what we find is people are usually on a spectrum depending on how they're feeling, and they might move from one to the other. But for the majority of people, they will lean more towards one to the other.
I see. Do you find in your research that the difference could be based on the connection, as if with the women, the egg and the sperm has already kind of like established that bond inside the mother's womb, versus with the male, it's not as, there's not connection physically or
That's a
physical.
very
Mhm.
that's a very good question. And to be honest, I haven't seen any research that actually talks about grieving styles associated to connection. So I can't actually comment on that. From my understanding, the grieving styles are more around people's personalities, around, what their personality type is. But when you're talking about connection, I have actually worked with people where the father has been more emotionally expressive than the mother. And again, I think that's personality. It's just, the mum is a little bit more stoic, whereas the dad feels he's in a safe space and he can express his feelings. The connection with the baby in the IVF process, again, depends on the person and their emotional connection. So some dads are very, very invested in the process long before they even start their IVF journey. And these could be people who have wanted to be a dad for a very, very long time. There are people who they're teenagers and they decide, I'm going to be a dad and I'm going to take my son to the footy and I'm going to, coach the cricket team and I'm going to do all this stuff. And so, that's their life. We have an image of what our life is going to be like. So we find that people who've kind of got that personality and that deep desire to be a dad, they have a very strong connection to the embryos as well. The women, yes, the connection does always seem to be stronger. But again, in the IVF world, it's the woman who's going through all the invasive procedures. She's going through the injections, the mood swings, the blood tests. So there's a lot of physical investment in the process as well.
Yes, I totally agree. And I do love how you put it together as well, that the embryo becomes the embodiment of the mother's desire. And it's possible that, the father wants to also have that same desire, to see
Mm.
their child grow up, play crickets, like you said, go to
Yeah.
college, get married. So they're anchoring those desires for that child in the embryo at the very early stage. Am I saying that correctly?
Well, that's what I find with speaking to people and also from the research that I've been doing around how people react to a pregnancy loss. So whether they've been on IVF or whether it's a natural pregnancy they've had a miscarriage, again, it all comes down to their emotional investment in that potential baby. So just this morning, I was reading on Instagram, Zoe Clark Coates, who's one of my favorite authors, if you don't mind me quoting her. She actually says, I hate the term pregnancy loss. We didn't lose a pregnancy, we lost a precious baby. And so she says, let's change the language surrounding loss. And I found that really encouraging to read because to me, what that is saying is it's always a potential baby that we're losing. We can be very scientific about it and say, it was just a clump of cells or, it wasn't real yet, which again is something I hear very often. For a lot of people, the reality is it's a potential baby.
Yes, and that is very comforting to know as well, for a grieving parent, that
Mm.
they didn't just lose the pregnancy, they truly lost, like you mentioned, the potential child that
Yeah.
they could have. And not only that, but they also lost that dreams of that future family that they really wanted. And and along with that loss, comes also the loss of themselves. and and so with your work, you are helping them come back to that sense of self again, so they can finally live,
Yeah.
and move forward in life, not move on. A lot of people do not agree with just moving on because it's not really about forgetting. It's
Yes.
moving through it and forward
Yeah.
with it, with whatever that we had experienced. So your work is very important in that matter. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Also,
love what you said about moving forward. You know, in the grief therapy world, we don't talk about getting over our grief. We talk about integrating our grief into our lives as we do move forward. You're right, moving on has that connotation of I forget about this. The reality is we don't forget about something as deep and personal and emotional. We learn how to integrate that loss into our lives and build our lives around it. And yeah, we move forward. You mentioned, finding their sense of self. That is also a huge part of the childless not by choice world, because for a lot of people, identity is tied up with being a parent. So, what happens when you're not a parent? The question of, who am I? What does my life mean? Where do I leave a legacy? Do I leave a legacy? Where do I fit in with society? They are very big questions. How do I fit in with society? They're very big questions.
yes, indeed. And may I ask about your insight about the word childless? Because I feel that society may have also misinterpreted what that is. And at the same token, there's an identity around being childless, right? The movie plays it, as the villain, or or that um stepmother that doesn't love the stepchildren because she didn't have a child. So
Yeah.
can you shed a light on the term childless and about the childless community as well?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the very fact that it has the word less attached to it brings up again that feelings of I am less than. I'm not a mother, so society invalidates me. We hear a lot about the invisible woman because she doesn't have a child. So where does she fit in? You know, I don't want to get into politics, but at the moment there's a lot of conversations going on about that as well in the US. So yeah, I think the term childless depends on the person. For a long time, I actually didn't like that term because it made me feel like there was something missing, that there was something not quite right with me. But I have since embraced the term childless not by choice because, again, that is the reality. It wasn't my choice to be without children. That's who I am. I think the term child free is used more by people who have made the choice not to have children for a variety of reasons. There are some people who use the term child free not by choice. And what I've heard them speak about is that they haven't been able to have children, but they're embracing the freedom that has brought them. So again, these are people who have reframed their losses, they've reframed what they don't have, and they've gone, okay, we don't have children. What else can we do with our lives? The fact that I don't have to pay thousands of dollars on school fees, that means that gives me the freedom to do something else. Or, the fact that I don't have to worry about childcare, that means I can focus on my career. So that's kind of where all the terminology comes from. And again, with the terminology, it's very much, my view is it's very much what people feel comfortable with how they identify themselves. I'm not huge on labels, but we live in a world where people like to label you. And so again, I would say whatever people feel sits well with them is what the term uses. So with the childless community, there is a fabulous community of people who are childless not by choice or child free, or people who have made the decision, or childless by circumstances. I think that's the other one. That's people who've just never had the opportunity And women don't have children for a whole range of reasons, and men too. So, like, for example, I know people who have married late in life, so they haven't been able to have children, or somebody who has married somebody who already has four children and they don't want any more. So they don't have any biological children of themselves, but they're step parents. So again, there is a big varied community. And one of the things that I found very healing in my own journey was actually finding the community, because then there's a sense of belonging. And I started off talking about being alone. For me, that sense of aloneness has actually disappeared, because now there is people who understand, people I can connect with, people I can talk to. And yeah, there's the main one that comes to mind is World Childless Week, which is run by Stephanie Phillips. They have their week in September. So that's a massive community, and it's a very encouraging and healing place for me.
Thank you, Anne, so much for mentioning about the support communities for the childless, not by choice, childless by circumstance, and also the child-free communities. So thank you for educating us about that, and also for mentioning the World Childless Week that happens every year in September. So that's great to know, and I'll make sure to put the information at the bottom for those that are interested in just learning about the World Childless Week. And speaking about the terminology childless, is there a right or wrong to use it? You know, as you mentioned, people love to use labels on ourselves or
Yeah.
label on others. So is there a right or wrong way of identifying, okay, you are childless not by choice, you are childless by circumstance, or you're just simply childless? Like for myself, I lost two pregnancies. Well, I don't want to say pregnancies. I lost two babies. I did lose two babies at 10 weeks to miscarriages. And
So
and I
sorry.
did IUI treatment, artificial insemination. And so for 4 months, I've been doing that, not really finding support or encouragement. And on the fifth month, I decided I'm done with it. So, what would be my category if I choose one of those terminologies?
I always say follow the person's lead. So, I guess for you, my question is, what do you feel comfortable? What sits well with you, and use that. And, for people who talk to you, follow your lead around what, it feels right for you.
Would you advise the same for other women who are experiencing the same?
Because I don't, my personal view is it's a label. And as women, we get so many labels thrown at us, right? This is, again, yet another label thrown at us. So for me personally, I feel like I want to own this. So I identify as childless not by choice, because that is my reality. It wasn't my choice, and I don't have any children. But I love the phrase, I am childless, but I'm not less than. So for me, I've embraced that, and that's what I use. But follow the person's lead when we're talking to somebody, see where the conversation goes, see how they identify. There are some people who are very comfortable with the fact that they don't have children. There are some people who are still grieving those losses. And again, I always say we never know somebody's full story until they choose to share it with us, because for some people, they may be childless, but they may be grieving many, many losses. You and I have both had miscarriages. There are people who could have had a stillbirth. There are people who could have had a neonatal death. So we don't know what their story is. We don't know what grief they sits behind their story. And until they choose to share it with us, I always say we need to respect and follow their lead of how they want to be identified.
And from your opinion, why is it so hard for these women to share their story and let the other people know about what the circumstances were, so there can be no misunderstandings. Why is that difficult?
What I have found, and for me personally as well, there's a lot of stigma. There is in a lot of cultures too, there is a lot of stigma around being barren. I hate that term, but that's a term that's being used. There's a lot of sadness that comes with, why is this so difficult for me? Other people seem to be getting pregnant and having children so easily. Why is it so hard for me? So for some people, there's also a sense of failure. For some people, there is a sense of inadequacy. Why is my body failing me? For some people, society tells them they're less than. Some people, society tells them they're not worthy because they're not a parent. So it takes a lot of courage to be able to actually come out and talk about your story, and to come out and talk about, why you don't have children. That's even harder because, we don't know what grief sits behind that. I've been in groups of women where, when I say, oh, I don't have any children, somebody will come up to me and whisper in my ear and they'll say, oh, neither do I. But they will never say it aloud. So I think one of the things I would like to see in my lifetime is that stigma of not being able to have children actually broken down, because we're actually not that much of a minority. I can't remember the stats at the moment, but it's quite big for a whole range of reasons. And yet we still are made to feel inadequate. Like in some cultures, a childless person is not allowed to attend celebrations. In some places, childless people are not allowed to go to weddings because they're considered, to bring bad luck to the newly married couple. So there's all of those old, I call them old feelings, and, centuries of, I guess, put downs that, whether we want to absorb it or not, is floating around us.
Yeah, it feels like almost like a shaming type
Yeah,
of tradition, in certain parts of culture or even the
yeah,
world. And it becomes like a natural instinct for us that, okay, I don't want to say it because then I will be shamed,
yeah,
or I will be judged, or I'll be considered an outcast or bad luck. Just like you
yeah,
said, they can't attend a wedding
yeah,
because that's a bad luck for the couple. And that's kind of unfortunate because it became like a stigma and a brand,
mm,
throughout not just the culture, but also as in humanity, I guess.
yeah,
And it's kind of saddening to hear that. And to those that are listening, I think the more that we voice out and to share what we are going through so others could understand us and avoid the misunderstanding, we just have to really find that bravery, like you said, Anne, to find that courage and muster that strength to really voice it out and
yeah.
speak it out.
And I think
Yeah.
for a lot of us also, we don't want other people's pity. Like for me personally, when I was going through IVF, there was a very small group of people that knew what was going on, because it was a very emotional process. I wasn't going to, I mean, I'm very transparent, but I wasn't going to tell the whole world what was happening. And at that stage, I also had a corporate career. I was very blessed. I was traveling a lot. And the number of people who assumed that I didn't have children because I was focused on my career, and people would actually make snide remarks about, oh, you're traveling the world, aren't you? It's like, well, when you retire, your career's not going to, look after you. When you're going to have children. And inside, I'm just breaking because I might have just had another loss, but I'm not going to say anything. I would just laugh and go, yeah, yeah, whatever, we'll deal with it later. So there is that as well. Or, if somebody actually blatantly says, oh, you don't have children, and I go, no, we've had a number of failed IVFs, and they go, oh, you poor thing, are you okay? And we don't want those conversations as well. So again, in my lifetime, I would like to really see people being better educated around childlessness, around miscarriage, around baby loss, and to learn how to respond and also to learn how to be a supportive environment. We talk a lot recently about being allies to different minorities. I would really like to see that happening. But I guess that's, a whole other amount of effort and work that needs to go in.
I totally agree with you, Anne, about the education process and adding that the education piece to how to respond to people who have that kind of experiences, because sometimes ignorance is not really an excuse to say what we can just say, and sometimes it's unintentional too, but then there's that ignorance piece that they don't know what they don't know, right? And we can't assume also, since we are on the other side of that spectrum, we also cannot assume that they should know what's going on with us, or and and then we get mad at them for not knowing. Well, how would they know? We didn't tell them, or they don't know our whole story. But then deep inside me, I really don't want to say, because then I will be shamed, or I'll be looked at as a poor peer person experiencing that. So there's so much things that are going on in that one little concept. What do you believe should happen then when educating others about this type of topic?
Firstly, may I say, I love that line. Ignorance is no excuse. I'm going to steal it and I'm going to use it. But you know what? You've encapsulated the whole thing. In this day and age where we have access to so much information, ignorance is actually no excuse, because there are books that have been written about people who are childless. There are podcasts, there are websites, there's Instagram. We're having this conversation right now. So, what I would love to encourage people is learn, you know, learn about what it actually means for people who are childless. World Childless Week is coming up. Get onto their website, look at their webinars, look at the articles that people have submitted. If you don't feel comfortable talking to somebody who is childless because you're afraid of how they're going to react, or you don't know how to react, Google communicating with a childless person, or, whatever Google search terms feel comfortable for you. Read a few books, do your research. And, if you find somebody who is comfortable enough to talk to them, ask them. So, again, I think over the years, what I have seen is people educate themselves on how to work with different people. Yeah, we've educated ourselves on how to work with cross-cultural groups. We've educated ourselves how to live in a multicultural world. We educate ourselves on, how to communicate with people with dementia. We educate ourselves around how to speak to somebody for whom English is not their first language, because English is my first language. Same thing. It's about educating yourself around communication, and or find somebody who can help coach you with those communication areas.
Yeah, that's right. And the education piece comes from self-awareness, right? And
Yeah.
being compassionate towards other human beings, not just because of, oh, they have that circumstance, and it's not about me feeling pity on that person, but it's more like I really want to understand. But it has to come with that willingness to really learn about the other side and understand the other person and the other circumstance. So, and I guess that comes with the self-awareness piece. If a person is not truly self-aware or not aware about the surrounding, then educating themselves, like taking the initiative to actually, let me pick up that book about childlessness. But I think what we're doing here, Anne, with your Life After IVF Foundation and the practice that you're doing and the podcast and other people's podcasts, what we're doing is we're actually bringing the awareness to them.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of
Yeah.
them having to cultivate self-awareness. We're like, okay,
Yeah.
we're just gonna present this in front of you and here you are, and maybe influence you to pick up that book
Yeah.
and learn more. So
Yeah, absolutely. My father used to say, if you can get yourself interested in something, it doesn't matter what it is, you will find a way to find the information to feed that interest. And, again, in today's age where access to information is so, it's literally at our fingertips. I really encourage people learn, learn about, what it means to be childless, learn about the challenges that people who are childless face, learn about the emotional aspect of it, learn about how you can be an ally, learn about how you can be a friend to them. I just read this morning on LinkedIn, there's a beautiful post around workplace policies for people who are childless. So again, if you have enough interest, you will find the information.
and can we briefly move to this topic about menopause? And
Mhm.
how does that resurface the feelings associated with your IVF journey and also the people that you're working with?
Menopause is a very interesting one because apart from, all the physical drama that women go through, for me, menopause brought relief because it was okay, that door of hope. Although I had stopped fertility treatment about 10 years before menopause, at the back of your mind, there's still that little thing of maybe, maybe a miracle will happen. Uh, um, so for me, menopause was actually relief. It's like, no, definitely not happening. Close that book. We'll start writing a new book. So there was a tremendous amount of relief. What I wasn't aware of is it also brought up a lot of other feelings because the age that I'm at, my friends are becoming grandparents. So all of a sudden, all those feelings of not having my own biological family resurfaced, re-triggered grief, basically, when a friend says, oh, I'm babysitting my grandchild. It's like, oh, well, that's an experience I'll never have because, I'll never have a grandchild. When people are talking about their grandchildren going to school, it's like, oh, that's something I'll never have. So for me, at the very start, there was this whole resurgence of grieving all over again, grieving for the life I wouldn't have. Fortunately, by that stage, I had already started my studies in grief and I understood what grief was all about, and I could acknowledge it and I could put in place strategies to mourn these losses because it is another form of loss. The other thing, again, there is also another layer of stigma, around all the grandparents get together and they talk about their grandchildren and what they're doing with their grandchildren, the grandchildren's first day of school. So there's exclusion. So that's that feeling of being excluded all over again because I have nothing to contribute to this conversation. It actually really hit me hard this year when everybody was talking about back to school and their grandchild's first day of school, and I'm sitting there going, I have absolutely nothing to contribute to this conversation. And although I thought I was in a very good place, I actually did get really upset. So yeah, the thing with menopause, I think I would say to people who are childless is be prepared, have your grieving coping strategies in place. The journey of grief for me, a lot of it is about building your grief muscles. Because, like we said earlier, we don't move on, we don't forget about our grief, right? So, there's a brilliant book by Megan Devine, How to Carry What Can't Be Fixed. And to carry something, we need to be strong. We need to build our muscles. It's just like going to the gym. The first time you start, those 2 kilo weights are ridiculously heavy. And then it's like, what am I doing with these? They're fine. I'll pick up the next one. And we gradually build our strength. It's the same with our emotional strength. We need to gradually build that. And a lot of that comes from self-awareness of our own grief, self-awareness of our triggers and having in place those strategies of how am I going to cope with this? Again, the childless woman in menopause, there's also a lot of disenfranchised grief because, again, there's no space for that. There's no space to kind of go, I'm grieving again, because society as a whole doesn't understand that re-triggered grief. And, most people just looked at me and like, but it's been years. What are you moping about now? And it's like, no, I couldn't articulate what I was feeling. So I can't expect people to understand what was going on.
That's right. So do you feel that grief can lie dormant in someone for many years, just like you mentioned?
I don't know that it lies dormant. I think it's always there, but it's how much attention we give it. The question of whether grief lies dormant, I don't think dormant's the right word because I know it's always there, but I think it's more around how much we acknowledge it and how much we honor that grief. So another model of grief that I absolutely love is called the dual process of grief. And what that one says is we oscillate. So we don't talk about stages of grief anymore, not that much. So we actually talk about oscillating. So we have a grieving space and we have a normal space. And what we do over our life is we go back and forth. And over time, we spend more time in normal and less time in grief. But the grief is always there if we need to sit and honor it. So when I say honor that grief, is what I mean is giving ourselves the space to feel it, being comfortable to sit in that pain when it happens. For example, I know in the days of the year for me. So what I do is I have my strategies in place on Mother's Day where, I might do something for somebody else, or I might just close the doors and stay home and go, I'm not seeing anyone today. I'm not talking to anybody. I'm just going to spend the time with myself.
If grief is always there, it doesn't appear as grief, when we do like normal daily activities. But then when it comes to, let's say we reach the age of being a grandparent, and then all of a sudden it comes flashing in that grief starts again. So yes, it's there, but it's not doing anything until it's reactivated. So would that be kind of like it's sleeping at that
Well,
time, and then it got reactivated?
very good question. Let me think about that. For me, and the studies I've done, I think a lot of it is grief is another emotion, just like every other emotion, right? So we have our feelings of love, anger, sadness, envy, jealousy. If anyone has seen the movie Inside Out, that's a beautiful description of, all the feelings. I think grief is, again, it's another feeling. It sits there. And it's whether we feel love all the time, but we don't feel that overwhelming surge of love, until we do something, like if I pick up my dogs and give them a big hug, overwhelming feeling of love, but I love them all the time. And I think grief is the same. It sits there, and then it depends on whether we give it attention or whether we move on. And also, if we look at that oscillation process of grief, we're spending time in normal. So we're doing the things that we need to do. And the thing is, as humans, it is possible to feel a lot of emotions at the same time. So we can still be happy, we can still feel joy, we can still feel contentedness, and we choose to focus on that. So, for me personally, I would say most of the time I'm joyful and I'm contented. Um, and, that's how I choose to live my life. So, again, working with a grief therapist, you can work through a lot of strategies around how the grief is there, but you build a beautiful life around it.
That's beautiful. I love how you said that you can build life around that grief, you know, through processing it and honoring it, just like you said. So that's beautiful, Anne. And
Yeah.
What
And
would you
again,
advise?
that comes back to your grieving style too. Sorry. I was going to say that building building your life around your grief also comes back to understanding your grieving styles, because then that helps with your strategies of how you do it. So for an instrumental griever who needs to do something, they might decide that every year they're going to run a fundraiser to honor the babies that they've lost. For somebody who is an intuitive person and needs to talk about it, they might have appointment with a therapist, on a trigger date to go and have a talk and express how they feel.
I see. So you help them understand their own strategy of how they do it. And then
Yeah,
from there, kind of like plan out, okay, this is how you can um, process your grief based on how you actually process your own
yeah,
emotions. That's
yeah.
beautiful. And so, with that said, what would you advise to give to individuals who are feeling those intense emotions, like that feeling of that loss, that feeling of angry, the resentment, that extreme sadness after like experiencing, fertility treatment failures or miscarriages?
The first thing I would encourage people is don't suppress your feelings, because if we suppress them, it's like that old cartoon where you keep sweeping dirt under the carpet and it just builds and builds and builds. And then it depends on your personality type. It depends on how those feelings come out. I have heard of people where suppressing emotions for a long time actually has physical impacts. That somatic grief, which is a whole different topic, but our body holds emotions, our body holds feelings. For some people, it can result in anxiety, a whole lot of different ways that your body's kind of telling you you need to deal with this. So the first thing would be don't suppress your feelings. The second thing I would encourage people to do is find a safe space where you can find strategies to process that grief. And the third thing would be to really have your self-care in place as well. So with the safe space, it could be a support group, whether it's online or real. It could be speaking with a therapist, working with a coach. There's a lot of grief coaches around. It could be finding your community, where you're comfortable, you feel safe, you can talk to people. Again, there's so many avenues out there. And self-care is a really big one. And that comes with that self-awareness, understanding yourself, understanding your trigger dates, understanding and learning how to honor yourself and honor your losses. So again, we started off talking about miscarriages and how a lot of miscarriages are disenfranchised grief. So one of the big things that I learned in my process and also in my studies is with disenfranchised grief, having it witnessed and validated is a huge part of the healing process. So whether you do that for yourself or whether you have somebody to support you to do that, again, working with a therapist can help you do that, and you can put your self-care strategies in place. So for example, my twins' birthday is in January. So I'm an instrumental griever, so I need to do something. So around Christmas, January, I do something for somebody else in honor of my twins. And for me, that gives me comfort. That makes me feel I've honored them. And I've also honored myself in that's my way of grieving. Again, self-care, I know that some situations are going to re-trigger my grief. So I look at my energy bucket. So for example, back to school, that's a big one, right? There's children everywhere. Some days I rejoice and I love watching the excitement. Some days it'll hit me that, that's a life I never got to experience. So again, it's very much being aware of how I'm feeling and whether I can go into that space or whether I need to pull back. Again, a lot of this is looking deep into yourself. And, and I would really encourage people to find a therapist who understands baby loss, and who understands childlessness.
What is your personal strategy for grieving? Like you mentioned, yours is instrumental grieving, where you love to honor your babies by doing something for others, and because doing that will also honor your babies as well. Kind of like, I would say, is it similar to like a love language, if you've heard that
That's a
book?
really good. I never thought of it that way, Daisy, but yeah, that sounds really, really good. It
Yeah.
is. It's a way of expressing love. You're absolutely right. I love that.
Yeah. So if you have that book, The Love Language, it's finding your strategy, like
Mm,
how you give love. Because when we grieve, we're also, we are mourning, but we are also finding ways to love the ones that we lost,
yeah,
and so
yeah,
and it's an act of love almost,
yeah.
right?
I
So
love that.
yeah.
That's perfect. The other thing I wanted to actually also just touch on, and by no means I'm not an expert in this area, but for some people, they have an enormous spiritual connection to the babies that they've lost. And again, depending on, which culture you live in, that can also be not validated or not acknowledged. So again, I would encourage people, if they have that really strong connection to their baby and they really feel the presence of their child, again, acknowledge that and work with somebody like yourself to actually process that and work through that as well. Because again, not acknowledging that can compound your grief.
That's very true. And have you experienced something like that as well? That spiritual connection with your babies?
Well, for me, I always felt that they were real because as soon as I saw their heartbeats, to me, they were real. So I believe they have a soul. So I believe their soul has gone into the afterlife. But again, it was one of those things where I didn't know enough about it to actually know whether it was real or whether it was just my imagination. So for me, I'm still learning a lot about what that actually means, which is why I mentioned it.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. And same with you, I've also experienced a spiritual connection with my babies as well. And to me, that gave me that comfort that I was looking for. And as a matter of fact, after meeting them in a vision, that's when I was able to move forward through my grief. And as I move forward, I was able to honor my babies even more beyond that. That's why I'm doing this. I feel like they are guiding me to do this podcast. And I feel like they are the ones that
Yeah.
are 100% behind this. So I will take it.
You're absolutely right. There's so many ways that we can approach loss. There's the people who are completely intellectual and they intellectualize everything. Then there's the people who are very practical, and then there's people who are very aware of their spiritual life. And for those people, you need to honor that as well. So for me, because I tend to live in my head most of the time, I find the research around the chimera effect very comforting, which says that your baby's DNA stays in you forever, I think it is. So I find that comforting. But, again, when I speak to people who are very spiritual, their take on that is, well, the baby is always there, it's always around you. So again, with working through the grief, it is really, really important to understand yourself and also to work out where that pull is, like you say, to honor the baby and to honor that and work through that. I always say, grief isn't like tonsillitis. I can't give you antibiotics for 10 days and then you're fine. It doesn't work that way.
That's funny. I like that analogy. That's true. It's not gonna go away. It's still there. It's like
Yeah.
seasonal. Sometimes it goes, sometimes it comes back, and we'll just have to learn how to face them. My key takeaway from this conversation, Anne, is just like you've covered, understanding the strategies and our personal practices that will help us process that grief, and finding the right therapist that will understand your circumstance and your story, or especially, preferably, those that have experienced the same or almost similar,
Mm.
so they can really, relate to the story. And then thirdly, it's having that community, and you shared so many, during our conversation here. So
Yeah.
thank you for that, Anne.
Well,
And
thank
as
you.
yes, and as we wrap up this our interview today, do you have any message that you would like to share with our listeners who are currently, facing their own fertility struggles or dealing with the aftermath of such experiences?
My key encouragement would be for continuity of care. So, first, acknowledge what you're going through, and two, empower yourself to seek the support that you need. Whether that's a therapist, a support group, books, podcasts. Look for what is going to help you process that and build your grief muscles, because this is a long journey.
Yes. And before I let you go, Anne, let's work on that grief muscles really quickly. Can you share, like, what is your best practice for making that grief muscle really strong?
So for me personally, it has been working through giving myself space to honor my grief. So I touched on it earlier. So for me, it's understanding my trigger days, um, working out my energy bucket, working out what is going to bring me comfort in the moment, what is going to bring me comfort long term. Long term. So part of building my grief muscles has been around learning everything I can about grief, understanding grief. And then the other part of it is also building my own resilience to cope with the bad days. So for example, like I said, Mother's Day. So every year I have a plan A and a plan B and a plan C for Mother's Day. And whatever happens on the day is whatever happens. But because I'm a planner, I like to plan for it. And again, just like doing, weights, it gets easier. Every year it gets easier. It all starts with acknowledging and knowing yourself.
Yes, that's very good points, Anne. Really love that grief muscle practices that you shared, and I hope that all the listeners take notes and also apply that to yourself. So thank you, Anne. Do
Thank
you
you.
have any upcoming projects or initiatives with Life After IVF that you would like to share?
I have started running online support groups for people who have finished treatment without a baby. So being online, it's open for people. It's Melbourne time, third Thursday of every month. And I guess the next big thing really is continuing to work with different communities around the place and seeing, what people would like to know about. The other thing I am also looking at, if I have enough interest, is running another online support group for people who are still on treatment but getting to that decision making point. So again, that depends on how much interest I have. So that's kind of the big things at the moment.
Yes, those are really big projects. So thank you, Anne, for sharing that. And I would share your links in here. Where can they find you if they would like to connect?
My website has all my contact details. So it's www.lifeafterivf, one word.com.au. The contact page, you can email me through that, or you can book an obligation free half an hour conversation.
All right, beautiful. So there you go. Everyone, thank you for listening. And I appreciate all of you who are tuning in. And our guest, thank you, Anne, for your time. And I know we went over time, but I feel that it was worth it, though.
Thank you, Daisy. I really appreciate the honor of being here.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Woman Collective podcast. I truly hope that you found this conversation meaningful and valuable. If you like what you heard today and if you would like to hear more, please go ahead and click the subscribe button below.